All right, welcome everyone to PK's webinar on preventing an API attack. I'm Elizabeth and I'm part of PK's marketing team. And before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that all attendees have been muted. We will of course be recording today's webinar and we highly encourage all attendees to participate in today's conversation by leaving any questions you might have in the Zoom Q&A tool. So I'd now like to introduce today's speaker, Lou Powell, PK's head of API Enablement.
Hey, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for some of you, and good morning for some of you. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. So today we are going to run through some ideas and concepts around preventing API attacks. So I'll try to talk for probably about 15-20 minutes and then give opportunity for some questions. So the first statement I want to make is that, or point of view, I guess, is, you know, the Franklin adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Reduce risk from the start. So the best way to avoid security issues is don't create security issues, of course. So that's the perspective that we're coming at the problem from today, is how do we prevent breaches rather than trying to detect and rectify a breach after it's already been created, which is truly the least cost-effective way to do this, is prevention, because we've seen so many breaches over the last 6 years, and they're ranging anywhere from, you know, millions, tens of millions, to some that have been in the $1 billion+ range. So reduction of risk is certainly the least expensive approach to solving the problem. So ground setting, or stage setting, for the things that we're seeing and why API security is of a specific concern. So this is from a presentation that was done by Apogee recently on the state of the digital economy. And one of the things that they're finding is that even through the pandemic, we're seeing that most companies, 75% of them, have maintained their digital programs. And of those 75%, 65% of those are actually growing their digital capabilities and digital presence. And this is what we know. The more digital you get, the more APIs you're building, because that is the primary connectivity of digital. And the more APIs you have, the more risk you're creating. So the more digital you are, the more risk you are putting out there. And that is just the state of where we're at. This is an interesting statistic that we learned a year or so ago from Akamai. They did a traffic study of all of the traffic going through their enterprise. And what they showed was that 83% of the hits that they were seeing over HTTP traffic was API-driven transactions. That's pretty significant when you look at it and say over 80% of all of the communications happening through the Akamai network were API-based transactions. And the interesting thing is that is a 36% lift, almost doubled. It almost doubled in transaction volume over just a 4 or 5 year period of time. So the use of APIs is becoming not just prevalent, but prolific. It's continuing to grow exponentially and become a predominant way for us to communicate in digital. So this shift in patterns, this is a statement that Akamai makes, has significant ramifications in the industry, and that's because the mechanisms that are being used to overcome this API traffic may be less robust and harder to configure or non-existent. So what they're saying is that the way that we used to combat, the way that we used to secure and manage HTTP traffic to ensure that it was safe is very different than how we manage and secure traffic for APIs. And I'd like to give you a couple of illustrations. So, I mean, this is kind of the way that I like to think about it. And there are a couple of challenges that are created when we are moving from a tightly coupled system to a loosely coupled system. So In this scenario that we're looking at, you've got someone using an ATM machine and they've got an ATM card. So in order to get the ATM card, they had to go through a process and they had to be authenticated and someone had to validate they are who they say they are. And therefore they now have a card and they also have a PIN that they use when they put it into the machine. The machine then takes that data off of the card and it is now trusted because the PIN was put in to authenticate that person to use that account. But let's say for our purposes that this person goes in and puts the card into the machine and they take $1,000 out. And then they take this little device and they go into the card and they put a different account on there that's not their account. And they put it back into the bank machine and it authenticates them and uses their PIN, but allows them to use a different account number. And they take out another $1,000. And then they do it again, and they do it again. This is illustrative of many of the breaches that we have seen in APIs over the last 6 or 7 years. And the reason that we're seeing these breaches is because many companies, they correlate authentication and authorization as the same thing. Or they're moving from a system where they had 2 trusted parties exchanging data, and they moved to a loosely coupled scenario where one of the parties is not trusted, and they have not changed their behaviors to match, so that the person with the card can now change the data. And if they're a non-trusted party, you can't trust them to give you reliable data for authorization. That has to be derived from a trusted source. So that's one of the challenges that we're seeing with APIs, is that when we move from these tightly coupled scenarios where we've got a website that we manage and it's going and accessing systems that we own, and we're creating that tightly coupled consumption, when we move to a more API-oriented approach where we're now using mobile applications or other things outside of the environment, we now have a loosely coupled, non-trusted relationship, but we didn't fundamentally change our practices. This is another scenario, and that is call center. So let's say in this scenario, this young lady is working from home in a call center capacity, and she is answering questions through the computer and has access to the systems. So recently her company moved from an internal system that they used for managing access to customer accounts to Salesforce. But the account access that they use has one credential that is used for accessing all of the customer account information. So once they log on, they can now take calls and manage transactions for all of the customers. This is incredibly common. We see this with many, many customers in insurance and banking and healthcare. We see this over and over again, where they have these credentials that give them broad access to the system so that they can answer many questions. But she's also very interested in photography. So even though she's on the VPN, she goes to the website and clicks on a link for a cheap camera lens, and there's a phishing attack. And they're able to get access to her credentials. And once those credentials are breached, the person now has access, whoever breached, to every single account in the system. So that's the second thing that we're seeing, is that the credentialing that's given is giving unnecessary. So it's not using the principle of least privilege, meaning I should only be using credentials that give me the least amount of privileges necessary to do my job. What we're finding is that the credentialing that's given is giving you the most convenient privileges, which means I'm not sure what you're going to need, so I give you access to many things and trust you unnecessarily, right? So the idea here is we need to be very thoughtful about what our authorizations give us access to when we get downstream. And in a digital world, when you've got access to an API that gives you those capabilities and not a screen interface, you now have the ability for machines to take action at broad scale, which incredibly exacerbates the problem of gaining broad access. So those are a couple illustrations of the problem that we're having. And the reason that it's happening is that we're shifting from those tightly coupled interactions to a world of loose coupling, and we're failing to modernize our architectures and our security practices to match these new paradigms. And when we are seeing this, we're seeing new things being put in place on the front where we're already looking at our network security and penetration testing and DDoS and WAF and all of those things. We're seeing some more rules being put in, but we're not seeing a complete shift to accommodate the common patterns that we're seeing over here on the left from OWASP that are causing most of the breaches in the API industry. And this is an example of what we're seeing. So as we go out, PK offers security consulting for APIs for our customers. We do this for many customers, and as we looked back across 2020 and looked at the findings that we have, this is the statistics that we've come up with internally, that we believe that about 75% of the reviews that we have done on APIs show, excuse me, show security violations. And 45% of the transactions that we're looking at have severe vulnerabilities, meaning that if they were not taken care of, there's a high probability that something substantial could happen from a security perspective if that was not fixed. And the only reason that we do not see those security vulnerabilities being exploited is because they are obfuscated, meaning no one knows they're there. But if they did find them, it would be the equivalent of finding a door to the bank after hours that's unlocked, being able to walk through it with no cameras and walk out again. And so that's the situation. No one knows that that's a door yet. So here's what we're looking at. So when we talk about shifting left, when we talk about looking at how to manage API security in a more thoughtful way and eliminate more of it rather than finding it and remedying it, the detect and remedy methodology. This is the difference that we're seeing. So this is how we find most companies. We find them in this state where they've got standards, security policies that are set by security teams where they're telling them, these are the things you should be concerned about, and this is what you should do. Most of those standards are focused on encryption, data management, those types of things, but they're not as informed about common development practices and authentication and authorization patterns that are being used in API development to prevent the breaches that we're seeing. So a lot of times we're seeing a lot of stuff going on, but this is that gap that Akamai was talking about, where they're seeing the practices have not caught up with the actual the security practices haven't caught up with what we're seeing in the industry. The second thing that they're doing is this development practices with development teams. So development teams are being trained by the security teams on what to think about. And then there are often security reviews showing them this is how you should do it, and you did it correctly or you did it incorrectly, right? So they're just reviewing what they're doing and saying, we're good with what you're going to do or make these changes. And then when they go into development, we're seeing a lot of absence of security. It's now you either understood it or you didn't understand it. And we may see some static code analysis in your DevOps process, but that's about it. And then we see a gate where we're going through governance and compliance. And the biggest challenge of that gate is that when we go through a gate, the number of things that need to be looked at after the development is complete are so overwhelming. This is a very challenging place to look where you haven't done all of the work prior to this and find the problem. So the chances are that you're not going to find most problems when you do a single gate at the end. And that becomes a big challenge. Or if you do slow things down enough that you can close gaps there, then what you've done is you've worked counterproductively against your digital organization who's trying to move faster to meet the demands of channel and engaging your community so they can grow your business. So that starts to create a lot of tension. And then the place that we're finding them today doing a satisfactory job is in monitoring and detection. We see a lot of effort being placed here, where security groups are looking at network security, access control, intrusion detection, pen testing, and perimeter security practices as places to focus. And again, they're looking at detection. Let's go find bad actors and bad activities, and let's surface them, and then let's remedy them. But that still offers an opportunity for somebody to do something pretty harmful to your corporation before you find the breach, especially with attackers getting rather sophisticated and writing algorithms that now emulate human behaviors and are looking more like plotters and humans doing interactions than machines doing brute force actions. So they're even more difficult to detect, especially when you've got problems with authorization and they're using valid credentials. So this is a very, very difficult way to ensure that you are secure when the bad actors look like good actors. So this is our recommendation, and this is a good slide right here if you want to take note of this. When you shift left, when you put your concerns over into the development process, into preparing developers to do things in the proper way, in ensuring that security is implemented throughout all of the development practices that you create and standards, in making sure that the security is a part of the development process and then bleeds over into your DevSecOps process. And then you're doing all of the things at the edge to ensure that we do not have bad actors entering and doing things we don't want them to. You now start to get to a place to where you can execute security with a much higher level of confidence, and you know that you are preventing the majority of your breaches before they even become some concerns. So when you look at standards, the things that we're seeing missing are data storage practices that are common and modern. So we see a lot of things going on with things like GraphQL that is not secure. It is putting information out there about what you're storing, how you're storing, and the way that those are being presented to communities to understand your data can create some significant risks. So we need to be thoughtful about what technologies we're making available to actors outside of our environment. We look at data risk management from a security and a practices perspective, that it's not just a policy, but it's a policy with a practice that says it's this policy done like this in these scenarios that gets much more specific and explicit about how it applies to the development process. Identity and access controls, that is a big, big deal. It's something that needs to be thought through from the perspective of modern APIs and looking at it and saying, when we talk about identity and access control, we have to be able to have secure and standardized stores across the enterprise that we can trust, that when a user says, this is who I am, and they present a token, that is a trustworthy token, and that it can be used downstream for presenting and creating proper authorizations. And we can use that across the board to build things properly. So sidestepping a lot of really bad things that have happened, identity and access control, if you close that door alone, you would eliminate 50+% of all breaches that took place over the last 6 years. That is significant. That is the one place that we look at and go, if you got that right, you have closed a lot of doors. Stack complexity and pattern awareness. So this is another big area where we look at it and go, we're not just looking at the piece that we're building. When we pass authorizations downstream, we have to understand what's happening. Are they using them? Are they using them properly? Are they trusting the authorizations? Is the person making the authorization request a trustworthy actor, and did they come about those authorizations in a sanctioned forum or process? So this is all of the stuff that you need to look at and say, how do we create these processes, patterns, controls in a way that we can share them with our development teams and do them in an intentional way before we get started with our development practices. And then in the second step, let's look at our development practices and not just have security practices, but let's start to create a security culture. And this is the biggest place that we see challenges, in that security culture doesn't exist the way that it should. Security culture often gets manifest as security shame. We don't talk about it because if you got breached, you did a bad thing, and bad things are bad, therefore don't do them, rather than looking at them and saying, when a bad thing happens, tell everybody what happened. Tell them why it happened, tell them how it happened, and tell them how to avoid it. So not necessarily inside of your organization, but looking at patterns in other organizations. So, we just saw a breach with there's been a couple of notable breaches, one with a social media platform and one with door locks that we look at and go, there's some lessons to be learned there about authentication and authorization. Those should be used as opportunities to create a culture of sharing and understanding and learning about what we do, how we do it, why we do it, and how we prevent it. And then making that development team understand that security is their priority as well. It's not just the InfoSec teams or SecOps teams security concern. And then app design standards and approved design patterns. So I like to call that pre-built, pre-approved, right? So giving teams an understanding of what good looks like. Giving teams components that are built, that are exercising the practices that we expect. And doing that in a way that you can even provide them with libraries and scaffolding that give you the ability to, when you get into the development process, start to look at those utilizing automation or in the DevSecOps process. Looking at reference architectures and right-size governance. So these are the things that you can do to set the standard for building things properly from the start. And then you've got to have processes for teaching these teams. And keep in mind, it's not a one-time thing. In the US, I would say that the last time I looked at the statistics, your average hands on the keyboard contributor is turning over at a rate of about a third per year. So 1/3 of your folks are coming in and out of your organization per year. So you've got an ongoing challenge of training and teaching. And plus there are new things emerging all the time. So there's this idea that it's not a thing we do once, it's a process that we continuously go through, and it's a part of our culture to help our teams understand what retaining security looks like. And during the development process, like we said, pre-built, pre-approved is awesome. The more you can pre-build and pre-approve, the less you have to worry about how did they do it and did they do it in a secure fashion. And this also has a benefit to accelerating teams' ability to do things quickly. As you say, I built it this way because it works and it's secure. And if you can use it, you can actually move faster. So that's a benefit on two sides. And then looking at continuous integration with linters and static code analysis to make sure that without having to put human eyes on things, you can move through and validate that things are secure as they're being built and illustrate that back to the team so that things don't go into production, where we can find, very simple things to ensure that there are, that you're not allowing for code injection, SQL injection, and you're not allowing for insecure methods to be used through the gateway, et cetera. And then continuous testing as well to look for scenarios where you're ensuring that downstream black box behaviors like authorizations are not being given to someone who created a resource they shouldn't have access to. Those are easy things for your development teams to test for, so that when they go live, they can ensure that the downstream system is implementing their authorizations and ensuring that they're not creating resources that an individual created a resource and another individual who shouldn't be able to get that resource was able to retrieve it. You immediately have a red flag that stops your promotion, and you can go downstream and correct that. And then the DevSecOps process, we've got a couple of things we would say add there, which is risk-based automation and risk-based certification processes, where you've got automation, looking at your scaffolds, pre-builts, those things, and you've got certification processes, which would be physical eyes on code based on risk, meaning when I've got PII or PHI or PCI type data, that there may be a need for me to get someone to crack that code open and dive deep and spend a few hours going through what the implementation was and what the diffs are from the last time the code was reviewed by the team to ensure that we are good. So that, but if it's something that's not sensitive, it's public data and it's inconsequential, that we look at it and go, hey, we're okay not looking at that physically because we ran through all of our checks, and the data, if it did get breached, is not going to cause us any issues. So we're not worried about it. Our front end will catch any bad behaviors in DDoS, or we've got throttling on the front end. So we're not worried about that exposure. So that's all good. And then the last piece of it is just that manual audits and certifications where necessary based on risk. So that is the considerations or the concerns when you go from, the detect and remedy methodologies that we see prevalent to a preventative perspective, which is implementing program, practice, and process to start to curtail breaches and vulnerabilities before they get created. So I'd be happy to take questions now if we have some questions. Okay, so the first question we have is there a way to ensure API breaches do not happen? No, no, there's not. I think that's important to understand. There is no way that you can ensure that an API breach does not happen. There is enough computing power out there in the world that if someone can get a hold of a token, they can decrypt it, they can understand what's in it, and they can probably present something back to you. The thing that you need to look at is, if a breach happens, how do I limit the exposure? So that was some of the stuff we're talking about, by eliminating accounts that have broad access to records. So in other words, if a question is being asked on behalf of a consumer or a user, how do we use user or consumer credentials to pass down that request? And that only gives them access to their records. And how do we make sure that the request only gives them the scopes or passes down the claims for the things that they're supposed to gain access to, but not everything? So this idea of least privilege, but also this idea of reducing risk by reducing the amount of exposure that you create. So that's the first thing that we look at, is how do we make sure that if there's an exposure, that the risk is so small that it creates that second benefit for us, which is the energy that it takes to breach doesn't give a big enough payoff for them to continue doing it. So even though we can't stop somebody because the brute force compute power that exists in the world is going to make that happen, what we need to do is discourage them from doing it because the payoff isn't there. They can't do broad, massive breaches, and if they could, the cost of it is so high, it's not reasonable. Okay, next question. What is the best way to create or improve our security culture? Okay, that's a good one. That's a little bit more difficult one to implement. But the first thing I would say is that you do need to have, if you don't have an API center of enablement that's responsible for overseeing API program, then you need to have a team who is working with your security team to identify security best practices and identify activities going on not only at your company, but in the industry, so that you can start to create that culture. And you also need to have ongoing training, whether it's recorded and something someone can just tune in and participate in. Ideally, you make those things like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, little bite-sized things where you're giving them training that they can go get and doing it in a way that's engaging. That would be a recommendation, but also just that weekly communications that give them one or two things to think about that reinforce the culture of security and reinforce the practices and reinforce the things going on in the industry. Okay, let's see. What skill set would you suggest for an InfoSec architect? So yeah, we like the idea that InfoSec has broader participation. So that's a good, so I think that the question actually looks at one of the things that we would look at, which is an InfoSec architect shouldn't be somebody that tells teams what to do and then unplugs. So my first answer to that question would be, we like to see those architects involved with the development process and not just the design process. So that'd be my first answer, is make sure those architects are not just involved with looking at the structure and the adhesion to practices and making sure the design is correct. Make sure they stay involved with the development team through the development process so that they can ensure that the application of those things is done correctly, because that's important. So in order for your architect to be able to do that, they're going to need to, one, be a developer who has architectural level mindset and has I like to think of it as the troubleshooter or hacker mindset. How do I break the system? And that's not something most people think about naturally. So you'll find people that are really good at that. And a lot of times people that are involved with testing systems, those kinds of things, have that mindset of, okay, I understand how it's supposed to work, but how do I break it? And having somebody in that architect role who knows how to, or who thinks like, how do I break it? They are really good at finding the fly in the ointment. And then the last thing I would say is they need to stay absolutely up to date on common breach patterns. So not just what we're doing inside the InfoSec world and our best practices, but what do we see in the industry? And then looking at how we do things and being able to identify, are those things happening here? So that would be a big part of that answer as well.
Thank you, Lou. This was really fantastic, and really want to thank you for sharing these insights and diving into some of these questions. So appreciate your time. And thank you to our attendees for spending time with the PK team today. I think Lou, you might even have a slide with some of your contact information in case anyone wants to reach out and speak with you directly about API insights and share some more of your resources. And please make sure to check your inbox as we will be sending out some additional API resources and also be sending out invitations to other webinars that are relevant to the API subject. So thank you again, Lou, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks, everyone.